Okay, welcome everyone. Am I audible on Zoom, more or less?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So the first question is actually whether the persons on Zoom could mute themselves. That would be very nice. And yeah, so welcome everyone. So we're very happy to have Professor Karsten Stueber here with us for the Extreme Belief lecture series. So we have had this lecture series, I think now for 3 years, and yeah, it's been very interesting, very nice, and so it's interdisciplinary. But today we have a philosopher, and so we organize these lectures and also every year or every half a year workshop. And our next workshop is next week. It's on responsibility and extreme beliefs. So it's on Thursday and Friday next week. So Professor Karsten Stueber is a professor at in philosophy at the College of the Holy Cross in the United States in Massachusetts, and he works on empathy, and I think has been doing so for quite a while, and is an internationally known scholar in the field. And he has published in the areas of philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of the social sciences, and metaethics. And I think, as I understand it, this is more or less the first exploration of the issues of your work with respect to extremism. And yeah, so we're very excited about having you here, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So it is indeed true that this is my first journey into the topic of extremism in certain ways, but I do think it raises, insofar as understanding is concerned, some similar issues that I have dealt with before, insofar as empathic understanding is concerned. So let me try to make sense of extremism and the manner in which I see it related to our attempt to understand the nature of extremism. So for convenience sake, I will just assume as a background Kasim Kassam's understanding of extremism, and he distinguishes between what he calls method extremism, ideological extremism, and psychological extremism. And insofar as the method is concerned, it does not necessarily have to be involving violence, but it has to be a method that in some sense appeals, is disproportionate given the goals that one has. The goals might be also unjust and illegitimate. So he defines them in terms of these normative notions. And so one might think about method extremism, for example, as these Republicans who have been called lately extremist insofar as they try to shut down the government and make the American government default. To hell with a with a global economy. We don't really care. We just care that our goals are met. Now then, we also have ideological extremism left defined in a multidimensional manner. The left-right spectrum, the religious spectrum, but most importantly for my purposes is certainly what he calls psychological extremism and the extremist mindset and thinking. He focuses particularly on certain preoccupation of the extremist and certain kind of attitudes. Insofar as preoccupations are concerned, the extremist seems to be particularly concerned with some conception of purity, moral purity in some sense, and he's also resentful and thinks of himself or herself as a victim. Tendencies towards violence, hostility towards compromise, indifference to any kind of negative consequences, and apocalyptic and utopian thinking. Tendency also to believe in conspiracy theories. Now, what is, I think, though important, and that is certainly something that we are concerned in this in the context of this extremist project organized by Rick, is the idea that ultimately extremists are ordinary people. They are rational agents like you and me who act for reasons. And so understanding extremist involves understanding the reasons for acting and understanding why they do what they do. It means taking their subjective first-person perspective seriously. And Kasim Kassam certainly does that, and he focuses particularly on narratives that the extremist tells him or herself about what exactly they are doing. And then he suggests that maybe we should develop some counter-narratives. I think ultimately, though, this way of focusing on the first-person perspective, just from the first-person perspective of the extremist, tends to not recognize the difficulty really that is involved in understanding the perspective of the extremists, because ultimately we are dealing with two first-person perspectives, the first-person perspective of the agent acting and the first-person perspective of the agent trying to understand the first-person perspective of the acting agents. And that involves a kind of mediation, and it involves certain kind of empathy. And as I will say, we encounter certain difficulties. Their imaginative resistance, as it's normally called in this particular context. So let me talk a little bit about the concept of understanding as I use it here, and the complexity of the concept of understanding. So when you look at the hermeneutic tradition, the concept of understanding was always opposed to the concept of explanation, and it was diametrically opposed, exclusively opposed to the concept of explanation. We have Dilthey here. We explain nature, but we understand the life of the soul. I think ultimately that's a misconception of what's going on in the human sciences, because we are looking for explanatory understanding in all the domains of scientific investigation. And when I talk about understanding here is an explanation. Explanatory understandings consist in having answers to why questions that in some sense provide us with information about causally relevant information involved in bringing about an event E, or causally relevant properties involved in bringing about an event. Now, insofar as rational agency is concerned, that involves the conceptual framework of folk psychology, and that means that we have to understand the mental states that allow the agent to act for certain considerations that speak for their actions. And that involves empathy, but it does not involve only empathy. As I will explain later on, I distinguish between three dimensions of explanatory understanding: the empathic, the theoretical, and the narrative modes of understanding. As I see it, empathic understanding does not exclusively define the human sciences. That is, it's not just empathic understanding that we have or that occurs in the human sciences. But what characterizes the human sciences uniquely is that it is only in the human sciences, I would say, that we have empathic understanding in addition to both theoretical and narrative understanding. So what characterizes the human sciences uniquely, I think, is the specific interplay between a theoretical narrative and empathic understanding. And I will show and apply how that should be seen in the context of understanding extremism. So here's what I plan to do. So I first tell you a little bit about my conception of empathy and explain why I think that empathic understanding and what I call reenactive empathy is necessarily involved in understanding an agent acting for reasons. And then I will briefly talk about the structure of rational agency and how that, and use particularly Harry Frankfurt's framework in this particular context. We'll briefly talk about the additional modes of understanding and then apply all of this to the structure of extremism through a detour of talking about trying to understand the perpetrators of the Holocaust and talk briefly about how we should think in this context about Milgram's experiments. And I will end up by suggesting that ultimately in those contexts, we end up with what I call the fragmentary nature of understanding, both insofar as perpetrators and insofar as extremists are concerned, because we cannot fully bring the cases of the extremist home to ourselves and understand how it is that we could have acted on those reasons that they seem to act on. Okay, so let's think about empathy for a little bit. And empathy is obviously a very broad concept, and a concept that has an unfortunate conceptual confusion behind it if you look at the last 50 years of empathy research. But what I want to emphasize here is nowadays people in some sense distinguish strictly between what we call emotional contagion, empathy, and sympathy, and I will focus only on empathy. So when you think about emotional contagion, that is the phenomenon of I am or you are catching an emotion from another person without you really being aware of that it is the other person that causes you to feel a certain way. You catch the emotion in the way you catch a virus. So in a room full of panicky people, you become panicky, but you don't really know that it is the other person that caused your panic. You just become panic, and it is your emotion in some sense. Similarly, in a room full of happy people, we tend to be happy. In a room full of sad people, we tend to be sad. Empathy, in some sense, is the recognition that I resonate either with a mental state or with an emotional state of another person, but at the same time, I am aware of the fact that it's really you who's feeling that emotion, but I resonate with that emotion. I recognize what you are thinking in thinking these thoughts myself, but in some sense, I do recognize they are your thoughts. I'm just imagining your perspective. So there is this self-other distinction, and that contrasts. That's the contrast between emotional contagion and empathy proper. Thirdly, sympathy is an emotion sui generis, a feeling of concern for the well-being of another person. It doesn't necessarily require that I resonate with what the other person is feeling. I normally have to recognize that the other person is in need. So I'm just talking about empathy proper, that is, recognizing what the other person is thinking insofar as I'm resonating with what the other person is thinking and feeling. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't require that only concerns effective mental states. Insofar as I'm talking about empathy, as I have a broad conception of empathy involving both cognitive mental states and affective mental states. And I actually don't think that you really recognize the affective mental state of another person without, in some sense, being aware of what other background assumptions that person makes. We can talk about that in the discussion. Most importantly, insofar as empathy is concerned, I distinguish between what I call basic and reenactive empathy. Basic empathy is a developmental early phenomenon, and in some sense, it's a non-conceptual phenomenon. I think it's probably something that has to do with our ability to recognize the emotions of other people, just looking at their faces, or even recognizing that my bodily movement is in some sense goal-directed. So you kind of see already that I'm grasping this glass, and that my movement is a grasping movement in some sense. And that is one of our basic abilities that we have to make sense of the behavior of other people. But that is a basic phenomenon. It allows us in some sense to recognize what the other person is doing in a very minimal sense. It doesn't really allow us to understand why I'm doing that. You recognize that I'm grasping the glass. You maybe recognize that I'm having a certain kind of feeling, but you don't necessarily recognize why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. So I think basic empathy, and I originally, at least, and I still think that's probably true, is mediated on the neurobiological level by so-called mirror neurons, or at least what some people would say a neuronal sharing of certain kind of neuronal stimulation. That is, there's at least an overlap in the excitation of neurons that have to do with the observation of the action or the emotions of another person. And the stimulation of my own neurons when I execute actions like that or have feelings like that. That kind of understanding has to do with providing me a certain kind of objectional understanding of primitive mindedness. I recognize these emotions that I myself are able to execute. So there's this feeling of like me familiarity. I recognize this is something that I could do in some sense. And I recognize that your emotions are something that I could feel, but I don't necessarily know why it is that you have those feelings. But I do want to say that basic empathy in some sense delineates the domain epistemically of smooth, skilled bodily movements that allows us to apply the explanatory strategies of folk psychology. But for the purpose of the talk, insofar as extremism and other factors are concerned, I will focus on reenactive empathy. And it's also what I would call a resonance phenomenon, but it involves implicitly, as at least, perspective taking and perspective sharing. That is, I have to grasp why it is that you do, what your considerations are that speak for your actions. And I do that in some sense, I would want to argue, insofar as I bring home, as Adam Smith would like to say, bring home your thoughts to myself and reenact those thoughts. And it's only in this manner that I want to say that we can understand your thoughts as reasons for acting. And so what I would like to argue is the reason why reenactive empathy is epistemically central for understanding reasons for acting within the folk psychological realm is that when we attribute belief and desires to certain agents, as Davidson says, we attribute beliefs and desires so that we are, and our actions are revealed as behavior of the rational animal. That is, as an animal for whom those beliefs and desires constitutes considerations for acting. What I think has been always overlooked within the context of the theory of mind debate, insofar as people thought that maybe understanding another person in terms of belief and desires just means to apply a kind of implicit theory, where we kind of appeal to folk psychological generalizations, and that's sufficient for making sense of the action of another person. I do not think that that sufficiently accounts for the differentiation between belief and desires causing an action and belief and desires causing an action as reasons. And I want to just briefly explain that by looking at these two examples. So take the case that he went to the fridge because he wanted to get a beer. I don't think we have any kind of problems understanding why he did what he did. The belief and the desire is in some sense obvious as a reason for acting. But what I want to say is it's obvious because we project a lot of our basic assumptions about what a fridge is, what desires are kind of normal desires onto the other person. And because that is the case, we automatically can make sense of, oh yeah, I would have done the same thing if I wanted a beer and thought that the beer was in the fridge. Now, that aspect of understanding is, so to speak, always in the background. And you might want to say that, oh, maybe it's just what's in the background is this kind of implicit theory. But I think if that would be the case, then the second case shouldn't be a problem either. He went outside into his yard in order to count all the leaves that had fallen onto the ground. Now, that's kind of puzzling to me. But if it's just a belief-desire explanation, and belief-desires explanation just appeal to a certain kind of implicit law that somebody, if you want to do X and you believe that Y is a means to X, then you will do Y. It's not clear why that should be more puzzling than the first case. Now, the reason why that's puzzling is because we need a lot of background information that would explain why somebody would waste his time to count all the leaves and go into, yeah, that doesn't seem to be rational. That doesn't seem to be a normal desire to have. So we have difficulty of bringing the case home to ourselves. What we need is basically, we need an understanding of the difference between us and the other person. Maybe somebody offered a lot of money for the person to go into the yard to do that. Now, if it would be $1 million, I would do the same thing. Or maybe the person is a biologist, actually. And we had a lot of Asian beetles infestation, and we had gypsy moths infestations in New England the last few years, and the trees were really badly affected. And so maybe that's one way of figuring out the health of the trees, how many leaves fall down, and compared to the leaves that fell down the last few falls. Now, I think there are better ways of doing it, but maybe that would make sense of why the person did what he did. Now, what's interesting here is that once we are given the difference between our background assumptions and that person's background assumption, we don't seem to have a difficulty bringing the case home to ourselves. What we seem to be doing is we quarantine some of our beliefs that we have, that the other person doesn't have, from trying to simulate the other person, and we put on, imaginatively, assume some of the beliefs, desires that we normally don't have, and then we run our imagination. Now, what's interesting, and I think Jane Heel and others pointed out, and I push that insofar as all of our mental states is concerned, when we make a normal decision about how to act in certain kind of circumstances, we have a whole belief set. If you think about our belief set as being almost enormously large, when we make a decision about what to do, of where to get the coffee, the cappuccino, you have certain assumptions that you don't consider. All of your assumptions about Chinese philosophy doesn't play a role in terms of deciding where to get your coffee. If you're here, maybe actually if you're in China, that it would play a role. But we normally are very quick to make a decision about which of our beliefs are really relevant to consider in a certain kind of context, and have no problem of adjusting our belief set to a particular context to make those kind of decisions. And those kind of practical abilities, that probably is not an ability that's theoretically mediated. If you look at what AI tells us, we don't seem to have a theory of relevance. We use our practical know-how, what Aristotle might also call phronesis. And that practical ability seems to be at play when we try to understand other people, and we use it imaginatively by putting ourselves in the perspective of another person. And that's the reason why I think that empathic perspective taking is epistemically so central for understanding the belief and desires or any kind of mental state, even emotions, as something that could be potentially a reason for acting. Okay, now, reasons for acting are thus mental states, but whose rational potential we only recognize insofar as we integrate them into a kind of holistic belief set, or the rest of his mental states that the other person has. And here's one thing that I think is important. That is, rational agents, as we know, are reflective agents. They have the capacity to detach themselves from the direct motivational pull of the desires and ask themselves what among the very many desires they really want to act on. What desires do they want to identify with? They have reasons for acting, and they have also reasons for these reasons. And in this context, Taylor distinguishes between simple bears, utilitarian bears, and strong evaluators. We can talk about that later. I actually like Harry Frankfurt in this particular context, who suggests that, look, insofar as we are reflective agents, and insofar as we try to understand other agents, we have to recognize their way of thinking about their reasons and their way of arguing for their reasons. But at one point, insofar as individual agency is concerned, we normally stop giving answers, because there are certain things at the center of our identity with that we strongly identify with. And at the center of reflective agency for Frankfurt, he says there is a structure of caring. There are certain things that I just do care about. Certain things are important to me. And Frankfurt gives the example of Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms, where supposedly he said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That's who I am. And this is a volitional necessity that in some sense is not externally enforced on us, but that somehow authentically reflects who we really are. And I think there's a point to that. Frankfurt doesn't seem to allow for the possibility that we might reflect critically about what we care about. Nevertheless, I think there are certain things that are the center of our identity as agents, and others are not so important. Which toothpaste I'm using is probably not as important to me, but it might be very important to you. You might care about what toothpaste you shouldn't care about it, but you might care about it. And so caring is constituted by a complex of set of cognitive, affective, volitional dispositions and state. I think, although, I mean, just briefly, I do think for Frankfurt in some sense, whether or not we care about morality, for example, is something that seems to be arbitrary. There's no reason why we should care about morality. Some people care about morality, other people don't care about morality. I think one can argue about that. The other aspect of Frankfurt where I think he is not sufficiently aware of is the situations and the social embeddedness of individual agency. What we care about is not just something that reflects me as an individual, but insofar as I'm an individual, I'm also integrated in a larger society. So what I care about tends to be things that other people in my environment care about. And we will talk a little bit more about it. And what I care about tends to be normatively structured in a whole range of ways that I think are important. Okay, does that make sense so far? Okay, now, when we understand another person, we ultimately will have to take care of what they care about and distinguish that from what we care about. And there might be difficulties in understanding another person because our care structures are so very different. Now, one thing that I want to just emphatically emphasize here, understanding never can mean that in trying to understand another person, I try to become the other person. That is a conceptual impossibility. And I think it never, ever was really part of the concept of empathy, if you look even in the 19th century. But here are two quotes. Max Weber: "One need not have been Caesar in order to understand Caesar." Most importantly, I like the quote from Collingwood's autobiography, where he describes his notion of reenactment and suggests that historical knowledge, which basically is reenactment of a past thought, is always encapsulated in a context of present thought, which by contradicting it, confine it to a plane different from theirs. That is, in trying to reenact and imagine the perspective of the other person, I'm at the same time also aware of the differences between me and the other person. And that means that I never reenact in a way that the other person is in the world. But I would want to say that's just what understanding consists in. And even if you think about trying to understand yourself 10 years ago, you encounter the same divide between you as an agent trying to understand your old self from the perspective of the self 10 years later. Okay. So if the care structure is very different, then understanding also becomes a bit more complicated, and it also becomes a bit more effortful. And we encounter different degrees of imaginative resistance and reenacting another person's reasons for acting. and we have different degrees of difficulties. If you just think about the difficulties of trying to understand the immense polarization that we went through when we talked about vaccines, when we talked about mask mandate, it's difficult to understand why other people care so much about what they care about. And so ultimately, what you may be grasping is, if you have the belief a vaccine denier has, what you can grasp is why that leads to not taking the vaccine. So you can understand in some sense a logical inference here. If I make certain assumptions, then that seems to logically follow. What's though puzzling is why somebody believes these things in the first place, and why they might not trust the scientific authorities. So in some sense, you're still puzzles. You have this kind of understanding, but you don't fully understand because you can't fully reenact why it is something that you should care about. So you can't fully understand why those reasons are the reasons for which the person really acted. So there is this different degrees of detachment, different degrees of distances that you have from that person. I just think there are different levels of empathic understanding, in the same way there might be different forms of scientific understanding. There might be some deeper forms of scientific understanding. And similarly, you might just say, look, if you're a religious person, you might have an easier time to understand another religious person. If you are not a religious person, you have some kind of understanding, but that kind of understanding will be different from the way maybe different religious people understand each other. But that is just the way understanding works. Now, just briefly, I don't think empathetic understanding obviously is everything insofar as we're talking about the social realm. Sometimes we are actually not interested in understanding the reasons that people have. If somebody comes into this room, for example, they would know immediately what's going on, if they know what Zoom is, if they know what a university is, if they know what a lecture is, etc., etc. They don't really need to understand why each of us is here. Nevertheless, insofar as we want to understand individual agency, I would want to argue, particularly if we want to assign moral responsibility, we have to engage in this kind of empathic understanding. Okay. So let me briefly talk about ways in which theoretical and narrative understanding also plays a role, and the way in which it actually allows us to use our empathic capacities in a more reliable manner. So when we talk about theoretical understanding, I talk about, I have in mind basically understanding that's mediated by some kind of theory, by some kind of understanding how things in general work. It's a third person kind of understanding. And the narrative mode of understanding has to do with trying to understand the individuality of an event by grasping how that individuality is manifested through a unique developmental process. So think about theoretical understanding in the social domain. We certainly have that kind of theoretical understanding. So all of this recent research in the evolutionary preconditions or the evolutionary development of human morality, if you think about Tomasello, all of this is providing us with some kind of theoretical understanding. It tries to explain what makes us unique compared to the animal kingdom, compared to what other the capacities that other primates have, and think only about some kind of theoretical understanding of how people in general learn within a cultural context. We are constituted, our cultural identity is constituted insofar as we are in contact with other people, identify with other people. But there seem to be particularly two features of cultural learning that are important. One is the conformity bias, that is, we tend to conform to people around us, and the prestige bias, and we tend to imitate people who have a certain kind of social prestige. And therefore, it might be actually very easy to understand why people adopt certain kind of beliefs. The people in their group have those beliefs, and the leaders whom they admire also force them or espouse certain kind of beliefs. And that makes it actually so problematic at the moment in America. Not only the people in your community have certain beliefs, but the political leaders, which normally were in some sense providing a counter perspective, seem to agree for their purposes, misusing in order to gain power, basically agreeing with you. So you have two biases that seem to allow you to adopt the belief that the elections were, for example, stolen. Now we understand how this is working. And I would want to say that actually allows us maybe also to understand what a person's reasons for acting really are. I mean, when in America and conservative communities, people tended not to wear masks. In liberal communities, they were wearing masks. We visited, actually, at one point, we visited Wisconsin. We probably were the only people wearing masks in the hotel. Now, you start realizing very quickly conformity actually can be a reason for you not to wear a mask. It feels rather odd to be looked at strangely all the time. Now, if we would have to live in this community, it probably would be very likely that after some time you give up wearing masks because it just becomes too uncomfortable. So this is one way in which theory might help you to understand those kind of reasons. But let's talk about narrative. And I think that Kasim actually didn't really say what narrative understanding consists in. So narratives, I think, provides us, in contrast to mere chronologies, with the sequences of events with a thematic unity by plotting them so that they can be understood as having a certain developmental direction, beginning, middles, and ends. So the idea is that you understand why somebody became what he became by understanding the sequences of events that uniquely led to the person being the person that he became. Explaining, for example, why that person chose philosophy as a major, emphasizing his reasons for acting, the accidental encounters they have that there was a teacher that someone inspired him this way or that way. And we can understand then why that person developed in a certain way. Now, the events, in some sense, are all causally related, but there is no unique theory that mediates all of these events in some sense. But in order to understand the causal relation between specific events of the narrative, you might maybe appeal to certain kind of theory, maybe conformity, maybe prestige bias, or you also appeal to understanding the reasons that somebody had. So narratives in some sense allow you to better take the perspective of another person. It doesn't make perspective taking superfluous, but allows you to take the perspective in the right way. And here's maybe one way in which you might think about the difference between theory and narrative, because you also have theories about developmental development insofar as human beings are concerned. So we understand, for example, that the ordinary false belief task people can only pass when they are 4 years old. Only then can they attribute false beliefs to another person. And so to explain that Peter, who was 4 years old, was able to now pass the false belief task in terms of that theoretical understanding of the cognitive milestones that people normally go through, is not a narrative. What makes a narrative is to try to explain something unique about a certain kind of individual. So explaining why Peter passed the fourth false belief task when he was 4 years old doesn't require a narrative. It requires a theory about cognitive development. What's interesting, though, to figure out narratively is why he became a philosophy major, why he chose to go into finance, etc., etc. But narratives are not something that we only have insofar as the human realm is concerned, but we also have narratives in biology, evolutionary theory, etc., etc. Louis Mink has this nice example about explaining why this watch looks a certain way, this particular watch. We understand why a watch works the way a watch works, but we don't really understand why this particular watch looks the way it looks with all of its scratches. That requires a certain kind of narrative. Okay, let's apply that a little bit. Now, why I applied that before is perpetrator history, and particularly the question of ordinary men, Christopher Browning's book, Police Battalion 101. These were people that were drafted into the police battalion. They were not particularly staunch Nazis. They didn't grow up as children with Nazi ideology. They were in their 40s when they were drafted. They were rather ordinary men. A lot of them came from the area. Actually, I came from Schleswig-Holstein, Hamburg, that area. And so the question that's asked is, these people were driven or were basically marched to Poland after Poland was invaded, and started shooting the Jewish population. And they were even given the chance, according to Browning, to excuse themselves. Von Trapp, the commanding officer, allowed them to excuse themselves. He said, we were given this task, we have to do it, but I understand if you don't want to participate. Most of the people did not excuse themselves. And so the question is, why do these people do what they did, given that they seem to be rather ordinary? And how should we understand that? How should we understand their reasons for acting? And so there are other books, Harald Welzer's books, which is not translated, which I actually like a lot, as TWO's ganz normal mentioned, Massenmörderwurden, and then we have obviously Goldhagen and Paul Roth. But here are the particular problems, right? So Browning would be how to explain that ordinary individual participate in gruesome mass exterminations, even though given the choice to excuse themselves. Goldhagen focuses particularly on what he calls the smile problem, where he looks at those pictures of these extermination events, people shooting people, but at the same time, they invited their families and they were seen smiling on those pictures. And so how can you explain that? Now, the one that I find particularly troublesome is one of the ordinary men from police battalion. They were all interviewed after the war, and when prosecutors were trying to make a case. So So he was quoted saying, I made the effort and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mother led the children by the hand. My neighbor then shot the mother and I shot the child that belonged to her because I reasoned with myself, after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing my conscience to release children unable to live without their mothers. Now, how can you understand that as a reason for acting in those kind of circumstances? That just seems to be absurd that he actually is in a position to somehow articulate this as an excuse. I mean, how is that possible? And so there seemed to be something like the limits of empathy. We are asked to, it seems, to make sense of the action of perpetrator by trying to take their perspective, using our capacity of reenactive empathy, trying to grasp their reasons for acting, their space of experience and horizons of expectation. Given that we encounter irreducible forms of imaginative resistance, we are unable to do that. We thus seem to be now falling back on supplementary strategies to gain some explanatory understanding. And those would be kind of maybe theoretical understanding, something like, what is it that makes people tick in those kind of situations? And here I just want to very briefly and very quickly, we can go a little bit about discuss that in more detail in the discussion section. So what we care about, I think, it's not just something that we care about as individuals. We also care about certain norms because we regard them as having certain kind of exalted status. I would want to say that as individuals, as human beings, we live within a web of mutual expectations that we have of each other's. And those kind of mutual expectation constitutes what I would like to call it, following Bikiri, social normativity. Some of those norms have a certain exalted status. They are not merely social norms. That is, they are not just norms like how to eat your food using a knife and a fork. We recognize that those kind of norms seem to be norms that are only valid for particularly cultural contexts, and that they are not that important. But certain other norms we identify with in a more emotional sense, and we actually react rather strongly when we see a violation of those kind of norms, and we sometimes regard it to be our duty to enforce those kind of norms. Now, what is important is to recognize, and I think I agree here with somebody like Haidt's moral foundation theory, those are not necessarily norms that have only to do with the avoidance of harm or with justice and fairness, but they are also norms of loyalty. If you think about nobody likes a traitor. Traitors are generally disliked. They do something wrong. Even I remember Willy Brandt. He fought the Nazis, but he was regarded in some context certainly as being disloyal to Germany. And even if you think about somebody defecting and being a traitor, it's not something that we necessarily value that highly. Think about authority, and certainly, and here I think it's some aspect that I think one should think about insofar as extremism is concerned, purity concerns, right? Concerns about racial purity, ethnic purity, on the right, but on the left also ideological purity, etc., etc. Those concerns tend to be regarded to be something that has the status of morality, and it's something that we have a duty to enforce in some sense, and certainly within Nazi morality, one might think that they thought they had a certain kind of duty to enforce those kind of conceptions of purity, ethnic purity that the Nazis talked about. Certainly, if you read what certain Nazis said, you get that kind of impression. Or just think about the phenomenon of honors killing. Certainly, the parents who engage in honors killing do love their children, but they somehow seem to have the feeling of a duty of having to do those kind of things. So by nature, I would want to say we are these moralizing animals, and we shouldn't mistake our moralizing animal nature with what one might call the moral stance. That is, norms that are derived from a stance where we respect the dignity of all people. Our moralizing nature tends to be focused towards the in-group. And I think that's important to understand in order to maybe understand why actually certain people take certain things more seriously. And I think what's important to understand is that context might make a difference about why it is that certain aspects of what we identify with in a moralizing manner are more important. And I think that exactly happens insofar as we are talking about Milgram. When you look at the Milgram experiments, one way to understand Milgram's experiment is to say that the situation just takes over. And that in those kind of situations, people just are obedient. But if you look at it from the perspective of the fact that we tend to be moralizing creatures, and in some sense, I don't want to be beholden to the 5 foundations of Hyde. I would want to say we are promiscuous moralizers. We can moralize about almost anything. Adopting a certain kind of belief about that the election was lost, we can take a moralizing attitude towards that. But I think when you look at Milgram, it's not just that in those kind of contexts, we just become obedient people. Rather, the way we should think about that is those kind of contexts make certain norms more salient than others. That is, the norm of loyalty is a norm that we are actually beholden to. And so in some sense, following what a person with authority tells us to do is something that we are normally feel we are obliged to do, that we have a reason of doing. And in those kind of contexts, we don't think so much about the norm of not causing harm. So in those kind of contexts, we tend to focus on one aspect of our normative life to the exclusion of the other. That's what situations allow us to do, and that's the way situations interfere with, in some sense, our first-person perspective. And I think that's important to understand. So ultimately, you might want to say, in those kind of contexts, it's quite understandable, in some sense, why people might not have focused on those kind of reasons. And so you kind of quarantine those kind of harm norms out of the pictures. At the same time, I want to say, it's still difficult to fully grasp, given the enormity of the action people engage in, why they actually were unable to recognize harm as a norm that they shouldn't violate. But I think it's important to understand, and I think for extremism, it's also important that we are moralized, and what you see in extremism seems to be something that happens at the same time. They have certain kind of experiences, they have certain kind of social context that seem to exclude some of the consideration and focus on these kind of purity considerations and overemphasize these purity consideration. So in some sense, purity is not just a preoccupation. It's in some sense that we take a moralized attitudes towards. And I actually like Skidkar's work in this context. That is, issues that people see in a moral light are more likely to be close to compromise and especially tied to people's motivation to become politically engaged. And this is exactly, I think, if you look at what happened in the context of mask mandates, demonstrations about mask mandates, people took moralizing attitude towards the way you show your face. And the face is in some sense a domain that's normatively structured. We are normally a little unclear about what exactly the status of these norms that govern how we show our faces. Are these more conventional norms? Are they more moral norms? How important are these norms to us? What's interesting, though, is that, I mean, even in a context like France, where you might want to say, people make a big deal about the veil, but then they didn't seem to worry about the mask mandate whatsoever. And when you look at the history of mask mandates, and if you look at the situation of the Spanish flu, feminists actually complained about the mask because they felt muscled in this particular context, a way of not allowing them to speak. So, but what I want to emphasize is situations might play a role in how we should understand why people become moralizers in a certain ways. So does that mean that we should give up on that empathic understanding, that we should give up on the first person perspective? I don't think that we can. The tension with different modes of understanding is irreducible. Ultimately, I want to say, even if you understand that maybe in certain contexts, certain things become emphasized, you still bring yourself into the picture. And so ultimately, you still can't fully understand why people think those things are important. But I do want to say, as far as understanding extremism is concerned, we do need to understand the extremist reasons for acting. We need to understand why those reasons are ultimately something that they care about. Our empathic engagement is thus always mediated by narrative and theoretical understanding of the conditions that leads them to moralize certain attitudes. And I suspect then Kasim seemed to suggest that we have to develop certain kind of counter narratives. I'm a little skeptical that they succeed to change extremists. You cannot merely reason them out of their extremism. One also needs to change condition leading to care about certain things that we have difficulties to follow. Might be unsatisfying, but that's the way it is. And that's the end.